The rule of thirds is probably the fundamental building block of all of the rules of composition. What you do is you draw two imaginary vertical lines on your image, equally spaced apart, thus dividing it into 1, 2, 3 sections. Two more horizontal lines equally spaced apart, and you have 1, 2, 3 sections. By placing points of interest or your subject along or near those lines, particularly where they cross, where they meet, you will get a much more pleasing composition. So how do we use this in reality? I've got a windmill over here which I prepared earlier. Now, if we put this windmill smack in the middle of the frame, yeah, it's a kind of interesting shot because it's a windmill on a nice day. But let me just step out of the picture. Just contemplate that for a moment. It's okay, but is it a pleasing composition? Would you think, that's great, I want that on my wall? Possibly not. So what do? We need to move the windmill to a different place in the picture. Now obviously I can't pick up the windmill and move it, so all you've got to do is change the direction your camera's pointing. I've got an imaginary rope attached to the front of the video camera, and I'm going to pull the camera over this way to place the windmill on the vertical third on the left hand side. So let's come over this way a bit. There we go. As we ease it over, it's looking better already. Right, now we've got the windmill sat on the vertical third on the left-hand side of the picture. The gap on the left-hand side of the picture is a third of the way in. But it's probably sitting a little bit high in the frame. So what we now need to do is to make the windmill go a bit lower. And we do that by tilting the front of the camera up a bit. That's also going to place that bank along the bottom third. So your windmill is sitting nicely in the crook of a vertical third and a horizontal third. Let me get out the picture again so you can have a look. That is considerably better than putting it in the middle. Let's just pop it back in the middle again. So we're going to go down and we're going to go left with the camera, that is, which has the opposite effect on the subject. It's not that interesting. Let's go back to something a bit nicer. Back onto that rule of thirds. And we're doing this with the video camera so that you can see it's just moving the camera. That's all you have to do. Now you can apply this to anything. It doesn't just have to be in landscape or a windmill. You could use it on a portrait, on a building. You can use it on flowers. And I suggest what you do is when you're looking at a magazine or watching a TV program, just imagine these imaginary third lines and see if it applies to the image. It won't apply to all of them, but it will apply to many more than you might imagine.
It's a town where most every visitor comes with a plan, a system, a mathematical rule. So what better place to talk about the rule of thirds than here at Las Vegas?
The rule of thirds is a great thing to learn. It's the foundation for well-balanced and interesting shots. Sure, it's a formula, but with practice you may find it's a good starting point. The rule of thirds actually goes way back. Artists have been using it for a few thousand years, at least since the Greeks, who discovered it. So what exactly is the rule of thirds? Imagine your screen is divided into thirds horizontally and vertically, kind of like tic-tac-toe. Where these imaginary lines cross suggest 4 options for placing your shot center of interest. The rule is simple to implement. Pick an intersection and put the center of your subject there. Why do you need this rule? Well, you might be able to manage to ignore bad composition with half-empty space in your frame, but nobody else will.
Too many folks only look at the middle of the frame when they shoot. They're so focused on the subject, they just plop it down into the middle of the frame. It's a recipe for boredom.
Using the rule of thirds helps produce video that is tight and well composed. So how do you use this rule? Well, here's an example. If you frame this shot with the top of the bridge in the center, you have a cluttered and confusing shot. Is the viewer supposed to look at the bridge? If so, then what's this empty road on the right? By filling the frame by zooming in a little and moving the camera to the left to cut out the roads, you've not only created a more interesting shot, you've told the viewer what you want them to look at in your composition.
The rule of thirds isn't really a rule at all, more like guidelines, really. It's there to help you when you're trying to figure out how to frame a shot.
When learning the rule of thirds, the most important questions are 1. What's the main point of interest? And 2. Where am I putting it? So why does it work? Well, studies have shown that when folks watch footage, their eyes naturally go to one of these intersections. Using this rule works with the way we see images.
Remember, sticking to the rules can stifle your creativity. Knowing when to follow a rule is just as important as knowing when not to follow a rule. When you compose your shot using the rule of thirds, you can decide whether it's your point of departure or your destination. It's up to you to decide how you're going to tell your story.
Okay, man, talking about the rule of thirds. Are you ready? Today we watch TV in a frame 16 by 9. The composition of what we see is broken up by lines. 2 go up and down your screen and 2 from side to side. And like the game of tic-tac-toe, your screen we thus divide. We call this the rule of thirds, and it's not just a suggestion. Objects follow along these lines or at their intersections. If you're going to shoot a film and want every shot to look right, apply the rule of thirds to all important subjects in sight. Rule of thirds. Good to remember how you use that rule. When you film a person and you're looking at their eyes to see if they are full of truth or if they're full of lies, do not place those eyes right in the center of the frame, 'cause this would break the rule of thirds and then you'd feel lame. What is right above their head is probably not important, so do not give it too much room, just go ahead and ignore it. Place those eyes right on or near the top third line. This eye line works for most shots, but not quite all the time. Eye line. Top third line. Just a little space above the head. Never place the subject in the middle of the frame. I said this breaks the rule of thirds. Now don't you feel ashamed? To keep the shots dynamic, allowing subjects moving space, put the subject on a vertical line with room in front of their face. We call this look and lead room, a place to walk or fall. Too much room behind their back and now they're talking to the wall. This looks pretty silly, which is the reason for the rule. Remember what I've told you, it's a very useful tool. No centering. Put the subject to one side and keep some space before the face. Now you got the basics for composition of the frame. Your passive days of TV watching will never be the same. The rule of thirds will give you those visual connections. Objects follow along these lines or at their intersections. You know where the eyes go to lessen space above the head. Where to place the subject with room before them to tread. My work here is done. I've said what I came to say. So let's end this class early. Goodbye. Have a nice day. Rule of thirds. Good to remember it. Eye line. Eye line's on that top third line. And just give a little space above the head. Remember, never center. Always put the characters to one vertical line or the other vertical line. And add a little space right in front of their face for them to walk into. Yeah, you got that. I think that's about it. And I think my song's done.